Primrose screamed. A hiccuping bat had just erratically flown through the kitchen window of her small flat, narrowly missing a large spiky cactus on the windowsill. The bat was bringing a message from the regional witches' coven. Although this was Saturday, Primrose had got a bit muddled and thought it was Sunday, so hadn't been expecting the bat. She had been taken by surprise and had involuntarily let out a ridiculously girly scream as it flew in. Between the fact that she was embarrassed by the scream, the irritation that she'd muddled the days, and the bat's hiccups, it took a good 3 times for the message to be delivered and fully understood. And it wasn't good news. The Coven Committee had decided that at this year's Halloween gathering, she was to be croned. Now, it wasn't that she didn't know that this day would come, but she didn't feel quite ready for it. Primrose was actually long overdue her croning, but a particularly busy time interfering in local politics had kept the coven so preoccupied that the matter of her age had slipped by without them noticing. For those of you unfamiliar with the ways of witches, female witches have 3 distinct phases in their lives. Their maiden years, when as young witches they start learning their spells and incantations, and after that they would graduate to enchantresses, which is the most powerful time in a witch's life. And then eventually at a certain age they are ordered to become crones. Witches who reach the age for croning have 2 choices. They can either choose to cast themselves under an invisibility spell, so no one has to bother about them, or instead can choose to change their appearance to indicate their chronological age, so people can avoid them, so that they don't have to bother about them. While crones are allowed some personal style choices, they are also expected to conform to certain regulation looks, which include shapeless clothing in dark and dreary colours, along with, of course, sensible shoes. All of which renders them somewhat invisible anyway, as no one really notices them anymore, so tend not to bother with them. After she'd thanked the bat and offered him a sip of mandrake water to help him fly a little straighter, she sat down at the kitchen table. She stared bleakly into the small scrying bowl that was there. As she stared at her reflection in the inky depths, she was surprised to feel soft tears begin to slowly roll down her cheeks. Although she didn't feel any different, she could see how she'd aged and changed. And she suddenly missed the many other faces she had worn through the years, knowing that she would never see those younger reflections again. Primrose sighed. She slowly stood up and went to look out of the window. She needed a plan. Later that evening, Primrose was sat in her small local Victorian-styled theatre. You know the type, lots of gilded plasterwork, red velvet upholstered seats, and beautiful ornate chandeliers. Primrose loved the theatre and had decided to go to cheer herself up and take her mind off of everything. As well as the plays themselves, the theatre was also a good place for some occasional witchy mischief. As you know, a stage production relies on good timing and attention to detail. A quick forgetting spell cast here and there and aimed backstage could cause absolute havoc, and Primrose would sit and wait to see how the cast would muddle through when an important prop or item of clothing wasn't where it should have been. Primrose also had a particular fondness for one of the dressers who worked there, Elodie. Elodie would go to extraordinary lengths to make sure everything was just right for the actors she was looking after. And Primrose had, over time, become somewhat curious as to exactly how fast Elodie could run up 3 flights of stairs, unlock a dressing room door, find the forgotten item, and then run back down to the side of stage, all in time to get it back to its rightful place. Tonight there had been a slightly longer interval as staff tried to fix the house lights, which had been flickering on and off during the last scene, making it feel like you were watching one of those old silent movies. You know, the ones where the villain ties the heroine to the railway tracks. Incidentally, Primrose had done this to unsettle the understudy with the ridiculously flamboyant moustache. Not because of the moustache, you understand, but because she remembered that moustache as it had been attached to the face of someone she had recently seen buying several large packs of laxatives, which made her feel pretty confident in knowing why the leading man had become indisposed so suddenly. And it was during this interval, whilst reading through the programme, that the idea came to her. Primrose screamed, not a girly scream this time though, as a hefty boot made contact with her abdomen. As she began flying upwards and backwards through the air, she quickly calculated what would be the best pose to add a little something extra to the shot, and momentarily dislocated her right knee so that her leg dangled in a particularly gruesome fashion. And then, after staying in the air a fraction longer than was actually humanly possible, she allowed herself to fall comfortably onto the precisely placed crash mat beneath her. Becoming a stunt person hadn't been easy. Well, actually it had been easy because she'd used a variety of spells to be in the right place at the right time to get the best jobs. But what had been more difficult was to learn how to give her performances a real but almost unbelievable quality that had made her so successful. She'd also had quite a bit of difficulty working out how spells worked digitally. Ordinarily, spells work directly on people's thoughts, feelings and actions, so there'd been a lot of trial and error with her recording and re-recording everything on her smartphone until she'd got it just right. As Primrose stood up, Elodie, yes, the very same Elodie, came over and helped her into a robe. When Primrose had started to be in demand, she began to realise how important it was to have people who took their work seriously around her. And she also felt a little guilty about all that running up and down stairs she had made her do. So Primrose had added a clause to all of her contracts which stated that Elodie was her personal assistant and would be on set with her. As the two of them went to get a hot drink, Primrose thought, it wasn't such a bad life after all, being a crone. It had taken some time to convince the coven to start with, but she had carefully explained that, well, stunt people are mostly disguised as somebody else, and that their real names are usually a good few minutes into the scrolling end credits list, by which time most people had left the cinema or had switched off the DVD, so no one really knew who they were anyway. The committee agreed and said, well, this meant that she would still be pretty much invisible, which meant that they wouldn't have to bother about her. But as they were contemplating rebranding themselves as a more innovative and forward-thinking coven, maybe she could pilot the idea and see how it worked out. Primrose sighed. But this was a contented sigh, as she sat sipping tea whilst listening to Elodie telling her about how the wardrobe mistress, who was often unkind to her team, had somehow managed to knock over a large mug of coffee, spilling it onto a rather delicate and hideously expensive beaded white dress. And how odd the whole thing was, as no one who was there at the time quite knew or was able to explain exactly what had happened. Primrose smiled.